Pois bon día, good morning, bon dia. Vamos comenzar entón, primeiro desculpar a demora que tivemos por que había que abaixar que se quedou salir no alojamento os colegas que no hotel chegaron antes de tarde, non pasamos un pouco e agora estamos controlando as que estén. Entón, a idea do coloquio este era xuntar algunhas investigadores que están traballando na cuestión que está anunciada aí de Speakers and Language Standards, pero a idea é esta, estudar as estructuracións entre falantes e estándares lingüísticos, os asuntos que imos tratar aquí, concretamente vai ser Flanders, Norway and Southafrica, porque primeiro Carla Amorós vai dar unha presentación máis xeral a partir do proxecto EstandaRev, que é daquela IP, da que estamos aquí, formamos parte. Van vir, vai falar Anderson Lucas Macedo, que nos vai traer unha presentación sobre Sudáfrica, sobre esta tese de doutoramento, despois comentarei un pouco máis. E mañá imos ter a Flanders e a organizan, que van falar de Flandres, Flanders e organizan de Noruega. Bo día. Chegades ben que estamos finais de fala. Sentaremos por aí, se queredes. Estou aquí. Entón, estamos facendo a retransmisión das sesións por streaming, imos gravalas, van estar disponibles na página do ILGA, e imos dar agora comezo coa primeira presentación. Vai ser presentacións de 40-45 minutos, sin de coloquio. A idea é que rematemos despois de unha hora, digamos, de presentación e debate con Carla. Cuidamos unha pequena break, e despois o tomaremos con Anderson Lucas Macedo, e que rematemos sobre unha media de 2 cuartos, máis ou menos. Hoxe e mañá, pois empezamos as 11, máis ou menos con a mesma pauta. Entón, a primeiro voulle dar a palabra a Carla Amorós Negre, que é profesora da Universidade de Salamanca, na área de lingüística xeral, e que traballa o que nos interesa aquí, basicamente, que é unha, creo que das maiores expertas, polo menos no ámbito español, nos estudos dos estándares, dos procesos de estandarización, e é IP do proxecto EstandaRev. Imos facer as presentacións en inglés, porque, porque venen convidados tamén que utilizan esta lingua científica para que queden aí gravados. No coloquio podense falar calquera lingua das comprensibles por aquí. Así que...
Moitas grazas. Bos días e moitas grazas por invitarme a formar parte deste coloquio. Moitas grazas a Quique, Elisa, ao Instituto da Lingua Galega pola acollida y a los amigos que han venido también, gracias. Bueno, como comentaba ahora el profesor Monteagudo, voy a cambiar un poco al inglés para la charla y también para la grabación. Bien, in this talk I will attempt to socially, politically and historically contextualize the processes of language standardization while critically analyzing the complexities involved in the codification and development of standard varieties in different linguistic ecologies. My talk will be theoretical, and I have used the term revisiting because I aim to highlight the new approaches being taken in contemporary studies of language standardization and management. Therefore, without undermining the great depth owed to the Norwegian linguist Einar Haugen, Professor Iris Bennett, in one of the latest and most comprehensive handbooks on language standardization, precisely highlights the limitations that many social linguists have identified in Haugen's traditional four-stage and well-known model. These include the reductionism of a proposal that is only or mostly vertically oriented, its linear and theological nature, as well as its neglect of the socio-political and ideological implications of the process. In fact, the circularity inherent in the standardization process shows that we must pay attention to other processes of normative reorganization, such as restandardization, destandardization, demotization, etc. As this kind of renewed framework illustrates. My position in this talk is to stress that languages are social constructions, conceptual elaborations that allow us to organize linguistic reality. In this regard, the notion of a standard is one of the many linguistic concepts that cannot be defined solely with strictly linguistic variables. The term standard is a problematic concept, one that is continuously redefined due to its necessary dependence on social, political, and economic factors. Traditionally, it's associated with a particular variety or varieties if we talk about pluricentricity, which is usually the high sociolect very often of a specific geographical area expressed in a specific style, the most formal one. That applies to the English language, but we can say also to Spanish, French, Dutch, Galician. The standard is usually defined as a codified variety represented in dictionaries and grammars employed in the scientific exchange of ideas in education, administration, and media. However, many specialists have emphasized various notions and differing scopes of the term in different linguistic cultures, and they have also approached the process of standardization from diverse social linguistic perspectives, as we will see these days. Hacker, citing the Oxford English Dictionary, refers to the notion of standard as an authorized or recognized exemplar of correctness, perfection, whose earliest usages in relation to language date back to the 18th century. Of course, Renaissance humanism had already promoted the codification of European vernacular languages based on the framework of the classical languages. However, it was not until literacy became widespread and printed materials became popular well into the modern age that these cultivated standardized varieties reached a majority of the population. Transforming a vernacular variety into a national standard language and imposing it on speakers of other vernacular languages was one of the main objectives of modernity. The knowledge and use of this national language would foster a sense of belonging to the same community and strengthen the bonds between its members, aligning, of course, with this socio-political philosophical project of modernity, which included the centralization of government, state administration, urbanization, and more. From the modern era onwards, this socio-cognitive construct of a particular form of cultivated language, the standard, became dominant in Europe, as summarized by anthropologist and linguist Susan Gall in this scheme. This idea of language as a discrete, clearly defined entity, heavily reliant on its written form, gained popularity and spread to many regions in the 20th century. So did the monoglossic ideology with its strong emphasis on fixation and uniformity. It's not surprising, therefore, that alongside those who emphasize the historical nature of standardization and its advantages, various linguists adopting a critical stance highlight the underlying ideological component that helps to naturalize and legitimize the existence of hegemonic and subordinate languages, varieties, and speakers, of course. This is because the linguistic practices of a small group of speakers are taken as representative of the standard correctness, from which hierarchies between language dialects are established. Hence, from socio-constructivist approaches, from different socio-constructivist approaches, it is argued that languages are discursive objects that have been constituted in alignment with nation state formation. The standard variety is not linguistically superior to any other, as language science has demonstrated. However, its association with high sociocultural groups creates a social imbalance in linguistic equality within the variational system of any language and linguistic community. Its existence entails the emergence of a linguistic complaint tradition, which, in Milroy and Milroy's words, requires that in language use, as in other matters, things should be done in the right way, forming an entire ideological framework. Professor Ingrid Piller has also worked extensively on this so-called standard language ideology in standard language cultures. This framework fosters the idea of a single bon usage and model of correctness, leading to the general population's intolerance towards the intrinsic and natural variation present in all languages, we could say. So let's consider the description of prescriptivism and standardization. The belief that language must be used uniformly and that one form of language is intrinsically better than another remains widespread among many linguistic communities with different degrees, as we will see those days. So, speakers in different language communities often consider everyday linguistic practices as imperfect, degenerate, and corrupt versions of the cultivated, codified standard varieties. The aforementioned monolithic and fixed conception of linguistic reality explains why the average speaker generally expects dichotomous solutions and assumes the existence of a single correct option among a range of alternative forms, as Bauman or Briggs also pointed out. As a result, non-standard varieties, oral forms, repertoires, and ways of speaking that do not align with the standard linguistic ideal undergo a process of erasure, even of their own structural complexity. From my point of view, linguists sometimes do not emphasize enough the difference between system rules, which govern the internal structure of all languages and varieties, and prescriptive norms based on criteria external to the system, such as prestige, for example. Undoubtedly, the existence of what we might call the standard variety language construct has been fundamental in the development of Western linguistics, as stated by Ling, for example, serving as one of the means by which the intrinsic and universal linguistic normativity of every community has been channeled. However, it is neither a linguistic nor a cultural universal. Standard variety is a type of cultivated language, but it is not the only one. It is not solely Western societies that have managed to establish cultivated models. All human communities consciously manipulate and develop their languages for religious, magical, communicative, or ceremonial purposes. Therefore, normativity, understood broadly as efforts aimed at regulating and intervening in linguistic behavior, is indeed a general sociolinguistic phenomenon. I would say this behavior corresponds to which Deborah Cameron termed verbal hygiene, an activity as old as human history because it's inherent to the perception of variation and the use of languages in society. However, prescriptivism associated with the regulation and planning of languages by linguistic authorities that propose norms of usage and correctness is clearly linked to the processes of standardization according to the opinion of most specialists. A non-prescriptive notion of normativity has not such authority apart from the social control provided by the society itself, points out Lassanen in a paper from this interesting monograph, Normativity in Language and Linguistics. The study of language in its social context, as we sociolinguists do, cannot overlook the normative prescriptive nature that speakers attribute to languages. This is clearly reflected in the general population's interest in knowing the principles of proper linguistic usage dictated by authorities, academies, and so on. As scientists, linguists describe language as it is, rather than how it ought to be. However, this does not mean neglecting or failing to address the consequences that prescriptivism and standardization have within the linguistic and social context. It is the responsibility of linguists to make visible the ideologies, prejudices, myths, and other factors underlying many linguistic attitudes and behaviors. And this is what I wanted to reflect with this little social media joke. How to tell you are on a date with a linguist. What's your recommendation here? I am a descriptivist, not a prescriptivist. This is one of the favorite of my students. It is important then to distinguish this normativity from the notion of prescriptivism. As Cameron noted, institutional prescriptivism associated with the top-down regulation and planning of languages by linguistic authorities is only one kind of verbal hygiene among many. Here we have the example. Here we have the example of the usage proposed by the Spanish Royal Academy regarding an orthographic rule that sparked controversy. It was the use of the accent on the adverb solo in Spanish, only in Spanish. The institutional prescriptivism or prescription, however, in contemporary reference grammars belonging to normative institutions, stands out for avoiding an explicit normative discourse of condemnation and for not directly pointing out linguistic correctness and incorrectness. It is done in a much more subtle way. However, the symbolic power exerted and influence by organization and other institutional agents is much greater and different from what Lukács and others call grassroots prescriptivism. Informal prescriptive practices by speakers themselves. These informal practices involve evaluating and judging language usages and behaviors, categorizing them as good, bad, better, or worse, more or less appropriate. Such practices also contribute to enhancing the prestige of certain varieties and their speakers, while conversely stigmatizing others. The example that can be seen below comes from the social network Facebook and collects users' comments on the correction of the linguistic behavior of a mother to her child in a children's program for using the Spanish infinitive with an imperative value. She corrected him, iros, don't say iros, say idos, the imperative one. Thus, we must bear in mind that the evaluative character associated with languages is evident in all linguistic communities, not only in Western standard language cultures, which show a tradition of codification and norm setting. However, it is crucial to recognize that there are different ways of guiding and managing normativity. In language ecologies, characterized by dynamic and complex multilingualism, many of them sociolinguistic environments with primarily oral traditions, the concepts of correctness and incorrectness linked to top-down linguistic norms, as understood in standard language cultures, are not prevalent. What exists, indeed, is a range of linguistic repertoires considered appropriate or inappropriate for the context or effective for achieving a specific communicative purpose. Norms, in this sense, refer to practice conventionalized through use, where variation is much more naturalized and multilingualism and hybridity are more normalized. In fact, language planning and management experiences in indigenous language communities in Latin America, Australia, Africa often demonstrate speakers' rejection of standardization, and disagreements usually arise when selecting a particular writing system for a previously unwritten language. Among the arguments typically put forward to promote standardization of languages with primarily oral traditions are the contribution it makes to their preservation, the enhancement of their status and functionality, and the potential for the language to gain prestige and legitimacy. As Julia Salamanca and others explain in books like Creating Orthographies for Endangered Languages, a standard writing system is often seen as necessary for language promotion and for the development of formal teaching materials. Indeed, it may also help create a sense of unified identity among speakers of different varieties of a language. Nevertheless, standardization faces significant challenges, and it is essential to consider numerous variables with ethnographic and field studies. These include factors such as whether the community is already literate in a dominant language or remains preliterate, whether ethnographic writing systems can be envisioned, and most importantly, whether the community itself perceives a need to begin the initial steps towards standardization in their native language. Linguists and anthropologists must carefully evaluate whether the creation of a writing system and subsequent elaboration of a consensual standard would find real application in the life of the community. They must also determine whether agreeing on a written norm would bring more benefits than intergroup conflicts. This includes assessing this local literacy or grassroots bottom-up literacy proposals, which are defined as the product of a grassroots kind of movement coming from within the community itself and involving community participation in all phases of the development. Therefore, standardization in Northwestern ecologies must primarily be self-sustained by the speakers of these languages, who must find an incentive in the development and learning of a standard. It is well known that the question regarding the base to be adopted for the formation of the future standard, unilateral, multilateral approach, is often very controversial, clearly linked to those who hold power and authority, of course, linguistic authority. Once again, we find that it is the introduction of writing, but particularly when an unchanging orthographic norm is proposed, that leads speakers to adopt more prescriptive attitudes regarding correct and incorrect usage. In any case, proposals to standardize languages in different linguistic ecologies must always take into account all the social, cultural, ideological, and historical factors that are decisive, determining the success or failure of the development of orthographies for lots of languages in the world. To analyze the ambiguous attitudes towards codification and standardization and its appropriation in different ethno-linguistic communities, we must not forget to ask ourselves under what conditions and assumptions standardization can aid in the revitalization of languages. The convenience of unifying languages through writing and the need for standardization has been clear in lots of European Western languages, but we must not forget that the creation of a standard for a vulnerable, endangered, and minority language can also have the opposite effect, especially in highly multilingual ecologies in the Pacific, America, or Africa, if speakers consider the codified variety as a standard that is too distant from their vernacular and show negative attitudes towards the new variety as documented. Anna Deudmer or Friederike Lübke show different experiences of standardization in African communities where much more variation is increasingly being incorporated and explicitly taught in schools. Starting from a versatile spoken multilingualism and combining pre-colonial and contemporary writing systems in the development of standards for illiterate languages. In many regions of Latin America, language planning has also often been conditioned by a primarily Western conceptualization of standardization. For this to have a real, positive, lasting, and successful impact, many Latin American linguists argue for doing it by reclaiming the epistemologies of the peoples and recreating them in contemporary formats. So now moving to these challenges of standardization studies in the 21st century, we know that the rejection of standard forms when they are very distant from the vernacular is very well documented in late standardization processes, and especially in minority and minoritized languages everywhere. Indeed, this issue is of a great interest to many of professors and researchers present here. We must bear in mind that the current social, political, and economic circumstances are no longer those of modernity described previously. The processes of codification and standardization of languages in the past were always conceived within the national state as a territorial limit. But the reality of the 21st century is radically different. Mediatization, the intersection between the global and the local, and democratization are also influencing the management of normativity, as has been emphasized in these publications among others. Consequently, the processes of standardization are being readapted and also reconceptualized. The ideology of the standard language, that socio-cognitive construct of exemplarity, must also be re-examined in this late modernity, where we can attest the hierarchization and changes in prestige which are occurring in different European communities, with a continuum from communities with very strong, rigid standard languages to cultures of less rigid ones, we can say. In the case of Spain, as part of the EstandaRev project we are currently working on, we are examining through quantitative tests, qualitative interviews, and focus groups the influence of the majority and minority language stages, as well as their stages of standardization, early or late standard languages, on the values assigned to language, to standard and vernacular forms by speakers of each language. We can say that generally speaking, younger people, both monolingual Spanish speakers and bilingual Basque, Catalan, and Galician speakers tend to be more lenient regarding correctness and much more open to the existence of various ways of speaking well, various best usage, which are fundamentally associated with clarity and intelligibility. Young people seem more enthusiastic about the idea of hearing voices from diverse social and geographical backgrounds. They value linguistic models and linguistic exemplarity not only for traditional qualities associated with social power, such as intelligence, but also for traits that reflect empathy and dynamism, including versatility, clarity, confidence. We have found that it's especially among people over 40, and particularly among monolingual Spanish speakers, that the ideology of the standard language is still deeply ingrained, with the continued association of the standard with correctness. However, the relationship between standard and non-standard vernacular forms is becoming increasingly complex for both speakers of majority language, that is to say, monolingual peninsular Spanish speakers, and for minority language bilingual speakers. It is clear that the use of dialect, our vernacular, socially indexes more identities than merely referring to working class or low sociocultural level in the four linguistic communities we are working with. However, we are attesting that dialects and vernacular varieties of minority languages have easier access to certain formal contexts, such as talk shows. Indeed, vernacular varieties of minority languages are gaining ground in different contexts, and their speakers have also more prestige and legitimacy than dialectal speakers of the majority language, that is to say, in this case, Spanish. For bilingual speakers of Basque, Catalan, and Galician, the process of vernacularization seems more intense, and as these languages underwent late standardization processes. Therefore, let this first presentation serve to stimulate reflection on how the very different standard languages are politically contextualized, ideologically constructed, and linguistically reelaborated. Keeping in mind that what is considered standard or not has much more to do with the notions of correctness, the standard language ideology, than with the amount of exposure or prevalence of certain uses. In general, when discussing the best language for the media, as we are working with this project, there seems to be a leaning toward the axis of authenticity, which is acquiring new values of the best language for many contexts. This is what Copland has also described as a vernacularization. A more positive valorization of vernacularity. So if we go back to Susan Gall's scheme, we can say that there's a growth in the prestige of vernacular forms in several communities nowadays, and the axis of differentiation of modernity are more dynamic. New values of what the best language is are, from my point of view, emerging. Naturalness, dynamism, versatility, empathy, and so on. So thanks very much for your attention.